Zone 2 is my favourite zone, so I'll put that wee disclaimer on this. If I seem to be talking more passionately about it, or people that have talked to me about zones before, I can't stress the urgency around how important Zone 2 actually is. Now, Zone 2 is, as Maddie said, kind of your aerobic, sometimes referred to as aerobic endurance zone, sometimes just referred to the endurance zone, or your long, steady state sort of zone. And it's the one that you want to spend as much of your time in as possible. Now, the reason why, from a sort of a physiological point of view, in Zone 2 you are working at a low enough intensity that you're utilising fat as your main source of energy. So we're really helping to increase our fat metabolism, which in theory will then spare muscle glycogen, which is our stored glucose. And if we have more stored glycogen come end of a race especially, we've got a little bit more energy and a little bit more to give climbing that last hill or sprinting to the finish line, as it may be. So there's a lot of benefits to maximising our fat utilisation, and it can be done quite easily through Zone 2 sort of training. Another area that Zone 2 training works on is helping to recruit what we call type 1 muscle fibres, or slow twitch muscle fibres. Now, these fibres are really good at clearing lactate. So if we think back to our conversation last week around energy systems, we're wanting to utilise lactate that's building up as a byproduct of aerobic metabolism, and it can be sort of reused by the muscles as an energy source. And I'll let Maddie explain how that kind of works, as his explanation before we started this blew my mind.
Yeah, so if you remember back to last week, we've got our anaerobic energy system, anaerobic glycolytic pathway, and the end product of that is that pyruvic acid. And depending on how much oxygen is available at that time, that pyruvic acid either goes into the aerobic metabolism following that, the aerobic energy system, or it's made into lactate as a kind of a storage slash distribution to get rid of it. If you're going in Zone 2, there's plenty of oxygen available, so that pyruvic acid flows straight into the aerobic energy system, and the aerobic energy system gets run more times, more often, and it's that sustained usage of the aerobic energy system that stimulates the adaptation. So if you're going just a little bit harder, let's say in Zone 3, you wouldn't think it would make much difference. But what happens is every time some of that pyruvic acid comes through the anaerobic energy system to start with, there's not as much oxygen available as there was before because of the work rate. So some of that gets made into lactate, and not as much of it goes into the aerobic energy system. So you're running the aerobic energy system less times because some of it has to get shuttled away because there's not enough oxygen to meet the demand. So you can imagine that your pyruvic acid drops into that aerobic energy system, it runs a full cycle of our aerobic energy, and then it gets more efficient at doing that. Some of the other physiological adaptations, because I'm all about physiological adaptations, Nick mentioned that you get better at metabolizing fat, and that happens because you get more enzymes that are associated with fat metabolism. You get more mitochondria, which is where this aerobic metabolism happens. So the mitochondria get bigger, and you get also more of them, which is pretty cool. You also get an increase in blood volume, so you get more red blood cells, which helps transport that oxygen around. And you get an increase in the size of your heart, so the pump, to pump all this new blood around as well. You only get that though, not only, but you get that mostly by spending time in this aerobic Zone 2. So what actual percentages are we talking about, Nick, when we're talking about that Zone 2 training zone?
Cool, so if we think back to last week, we set ourselves a threshold heart rate from our field test. As a percentage of that threshold heart rate, for like a run Zone 2, you're looking at around 85 to 89%. And for biking, it's about 81 to 89%. So it's a relatively low heart rate. when we look at it compared to threshold, and obviously even lower if you're used to using max heart rate. It's going to be quite a low percentage. But like I said, that enables us to really get a really nice training benefit for our fat utilization, preserving our muscle glycogen, and as Matty said, keeping that aerobic wheel turning more and more, which will give us those benefits down the track. So a training session that you might see on a program for a zone 2 is going to look quite boring, probably. It's going to be generally maybe a 10-15 minute warm up where you might be zone 1, a few little accelerations, and then it's into a big chunk generally of zone 2. So it tends to be the sessions where it's go out for a 3-hour ride or a 1-hour run or an hour and a half run or whatever it might be, where the tricky part for a lot of athletes is actually that slowing down part of it. You know, you might go out with a group of friends and they take off and you're like, well, my heart rate's in now zone 5, and you want to pull it back. So zone 2 work does tend to work out better by yourself, dare I say it. It's a lot easier to control yourself when it's just you. It's a lot easier to control your heart rate when you can control the terrain as well. So obviously anytime you start going up a hill, your heart rate's going to go up naturally. So if you're on a bike, you need to slow down to keep your heart rate in that zone. And runners tend to struggle the most, I find, because it means sometimes they have to walk. Now, I did read an article that Maddie might be able to comment on around if you're a runner and you're training for a running race and sticking in zone 2 isn't possible by running when you go by running slow enough up a hill, then you should throw away the fact that your heart rate's now in zone 3 and keep running as opposed to walking from a mechanical point of view. And that might be something we can delve into a bit later on, but it's just an interesting side note about running and heart rates.
Yeah, big time. And I think it's a good point. And I think the more important point is if you're a runner and you're doing a zone 2 session and your heart rate's in zone 3 because you're running up a hill, you should be running somewhere else. Do you know what I mean? Like if you want to get the most out of your session. And I think that's a key thing, and we talked about it last week, is planning for success in your sessions when it comes to sticking to your training zones. Like, don't go out and do a massive hilly run when it's a zone 2 workout, or don't go running where there's lots of people and you feel socially pressured that you need to run faster. Go run on the flat in the dark so people don't see how slow you're going, because often that's the ego gets in the way a little bit. You don't really feel like you're doing anything, and that's one of the biggest points, I guess, of these conversations we're having around training zones, is understanding why you need to be going, or doing a certain thing, so that hopefully that helps change how you do it. Because if you know why you need to be doing something, then it often becomes a little clearer. And I think a lot of people think that I need to be training harder because that's what gets me the results. Well, if you want to improve your fat metabolism, if you want to improve your aerobic capacity, then you actually need, in a lot of cases, you need to slow down, because your aerobic energy system isn't actually getting worked to its fullest capacity when you go faster, because more anaerobic energy comes into it and you're not getting the training impulse or the training stimulus that's going to maximize that aerobic output.
Yeah, and I think looking at the percentage breakdown of what a professional athlete or an athlete with a lot of time in their week for training, their percentage doesn't get harder, it just gets longer. So the amount of training they do at zone 2 will still be relative to something that an age grouper or a weekend warrior type of athlete will do. They just have more recovery time afterwards, so their longer sessions can be longer, but the intensity doesn't go up because they will still burn out the same as anybody will, really. So keeping that intensity down when it needs to be down, that enables you then to go hard when you've got a hard session. And as you get closer to your goal races, the plan will change and there'll be more intensity. But the overall structure for say a 12-week period or a 16-week block will still be around about an 80% lower zone 2 zone 1 intensities compared to sort of 10% zone 3 and 4, and maybe 5 to 10% in zone 5 as well. For me, zone 2 is the walls to your house, and from then you can put the zone 3 is kind of the windows, and I'll explain why I only consider them to be windows next week. Zone 4 is your roof, and zone 5 is the chimney or the deck that you put on the outside of your house. The foundations and the concrete block are your nutrition and your mental skills, because they're there all the time, and you can have an average diet, but you can still go out and train okay, but they get stronger and better the more you work on them and put into them. So hopefully that analogy can kind of help with, right, I need to put some good solid walls up before I try and put a roof on, because otherwise it's just going to fall over eventually.
I often get asked, like, how much of my time should I be spending in my zone 2 out on a long session? What, because there is some drift that happens. It will drift down, it might drift up. And what I like to say is you want to spend the majority of the time in the zone, whatever the zone might be prescribed, because there is some drift that happens, and planning our route can help with that, avoiding too many hills. But you might have a headwind for a little bit of the time. You're trying to slow down, but if you slow down anymore, you're going to fall off your bike because you're going so slowly. So try and spend the majority of the time. If you drift out of it, try and dial back your intensity and sort it out, and get back into the zone as quickly as possible. And again, the other side of the coin as well, if you start to go too slowly, is that a bad thing? I would say it's less of a bad thing to go slower than it is to go faster. So if you've got a roaring tailwind for whatever reason, and you can't get your heart rate out of that zone 1 into that zone 2, don't stress about it, because you're still going to be very aerobic in zone 1. You're just not running that aerobic energy system at the same rate. So ideally you want to be in zone 2. Try not to drift up out of it too much. If you drop down out of it, don't stress too much. Try and get back in there. So spending the majority of the time within that zone is where we want to be. Anything else to add about heart rate zone 2 or training zone 2?
No, I think for now that's a good cover. And I think as we move into zones 3 and 4, the whole picture will start to come together for people. So best thing you can do is just go out there and do those field tests, find out your zones, set them up on your Garmin, Polar, Sunto, Wahoo, whatever you're using these days, so you know what you're doing when you're out training. But also, don't feel like they have to restrict you. If you want to go out for a ride with your mates and go hard, and in a bunch race or a bunch run, do it. This isn't something to be structured to the point where you're very military, but it's a way to utilize training tools that we have to get the most out of your training if you want to.